Moderating the panel of data centers, the backbone of our new world order, is Jabez Tan, who is the head of research at Structure Research. Jabez has always been the go-to person for data center market of Asia Pacific and is well known for his outstanding in-depth research. His major coverage focuses on the data center infrastructure market, producing in-depth market intelligence reports and analytical insights on the data center co-location, competitive and strategic landscape. More than half the people in this event, I'm sure, are already aware of who you are, Jabez, and your contributions to the DC market. So welcome. On the panel, we have Mayank Srivastava, CEO Indonesia and CDO at BDX Data Centers. Mr. Srivastava is a seasoned professional in the data center industry with over a quarter century of experience, covering everything from corporate strategy and development, design and build, mergers and acquisitions to product sales with a specialization in go-to-market strategies. Welcome, Mr. Srivastava. We are really honored to have you on the panel. The next person we have on the panel is Mr. Michael Gore, Vice President and General Manager, Aipac at Iron Mountain Data Centers. Michael specializes in Singapore and India's data center market development and Aipac's IT market intelligence. Prior to Iron Mountain, Michael spent 12 years in NTT Communications. He successfully launched and grew NTT's data center business in Singapore. Along with his team, helped to launch and manage NTT's cloud and domestic connectivity products. So welcome, Michael, to the event. We look forward to know what your thoughts are around the Indian and Singapore market. Next on the panel, we have Mr. Vipin Shirsat, Managing Director, India for Princeton Digital Group. Vipin Shirsat has led high growth businesses in India with major global companies. Most recently, he was a senior leader at STT GDC, driving exceptional growth by working closely with the global hyperscalers and internet companies. Prior to which, Vipin worked at the Tata Group and American Express. Welcome, Mr. Vipin, to the panel. We're glad to have you on board. So over to you, Jabez. We're looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Litsa, for the world-class introductions and really nice to be part of this panel. Let's just dive into it, given that the audience really wants to hear the insights from Michael, Mayank, and Vipin here. And let's just start by just talking about the overall kind of landscape of the India data center market. Where has it come from over the last 2 to 3 years, pre-COVID and then during COVID, and then where it is today? And also, where do you think we're headed? So I think it's a kind of a good question to kick off and just level set everyone from the panelists to the audience in terms of how to frame the India data center market. So maybe Vipin, we'll start with you. You could just share, how you view the India data center landscape. How has it come from, 2-3 years ago to today, and where do you think it's headed?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, Jabez, and thank you so much, W Media, for hosting me on this panel. Jabez, the most secular source of growth has not really changed in the last 10 years. It is the enterprises who these days are creating more information, processing more information, storing more information, and consuming more information. I think that trend will continue over a period of time, and that is where most of the thing is coming. Just to give you an example, right? Office 365 has started giving weekly analytics or monthly analytics. It tells me how quickly do I respond to emails and how much free time do I have and who do I work or collaborate most with. So that's what organizations are doing. Even today, there is a lot of on-premise setups that enterprises have, which will move to co-location or cloud. I think that's at the core. There are obviously new use cases that are evolving, and some of these use cases are around, let's say, work from home or gaming or remote education. And these are the specific use cases that are evolved, especially during COVID. I think they just leapfrogged around 4 or 5 years what we would have seen in terms. There are a few industries which are way ahead of the rest when we look at this demand. One is BFI. It has traditionally been ahead of everyone, and even today BFI lead the entire segment. Be it stock exchanges, domestic banks, MNC banks. While select few want captive environment for themselves, but most of them are happy to go to a co-location, or for that matter, even to a cloud. For use cases like DR, they would prefer to go to cloud as well. The second large statement is ITES. These are system integrators, technology companies who use the setup for their own consumption as well as for their customers. And they also require some kind of flexibility in the growth. So, these segments put together, they would continue to grow. One segment which is very large and yet to explode is government. So government has adopted certain policies to look at cloud. There's a policy called as cloud first. basis which the government has stopped creating its own data centers, co-location data centers. There are policies to help other government departments to figure out how to go to cloud. It could be private clouds, it could be public clouds, it could also be government community clouds. So that segment, I think, is something that we expect to explode in next 2-3 years. And then there are these new age organizations, right, which are directly going cloud first. I mean, some of them have cloud native apps, and these organizations is something that we need to watch for, how they grow and how much do they contribute over the next 2-3 years. And apart from this, there are things like, in the earlier panel, we just heard about data localization or data protection. Those use cases would keep coming. But I think our focus would definitely remain on the secular segment of enterprises growing and demanding more.
Thanks, Vipin. And Mayank, let's just move over to you. Do you sort of agree with Vipin's take on the current landscape? He singled out the banking, finance vertical, system integrators, as well as government being a big driver of growth and demand for data centers in general, whether it be on-premise, co-location, or even cloud infrastructure. Are you seeing the same things over at BDX?
So yes, Jabez, and before that, it's good to see you. It's been a while, Vipin. And hi, Michael. Good to meet you. So,
Hello.
hey. So I think I completely agree with Vipin. These are other segments which are sort of driving growth. And just to add to what Vipin said, I think the new kids on the block are the internet companies, right? So there are these guys who are cloud providers, but there are a ton of guys who are not cloud providers and who are still consuming, the data center is the factory for these guys, right? So that's sort of the other big segment that we're seeing gobble up a large sort of portion of demand. The interesting thing that we've noticed at BDX and otherwise as I engage with some of friends in these industries is that many of them, though they started cloud native, but are now either already moved on-prem. So some of the larger ones, like for example, Uber, where Dean led sort of the reverse migration from cloud. He took Uber back on-prem. Similar sort of sentiments are increasingly being seen for significant parts of IT loads for enterprises who have grown beyond a certain threshold, if I may, where they have the bargaining power for infrastructure, for servers, for equipment, to be able to get similar sort of economics as compared to perhaps what they would, or maybe lower than what they would end up paying if they were on the cloud for predictable loads. So that's an interesting trend that we see. So yes, the enterprises are moving from on-prem to colo to cloud, but a reverse migration from cloud to colo is a trend that we are also seeing in BDX.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you made, Mayank. And I think we've also seen it happen from companies like Dropbox, which is sort of one of the US-based companies that have pioneered that reverse migration or repatriation, as many people call it, back from they went to the public cloud and then they decided to go back to an on-prem. And I'm guessing when you say on-prem, it could also mean back to a co-location environment within a third-party data set, not just within their own sort of proprietary self-built sites. Right. And Michael, maybe let's move over to you. Are you seeing the same things as Mayank and Vipin in terms of demand in India, cloud repatriation back to colo? Because you guys are very global. You have a big North America footprint. You're expanding rapidly in Europe, and now in Asia, you guys are just getting started with that expansion. Tell us a little bit more about how you're seeing the landscape.
Yeah, hello, Jabez. Good to see you, and good evening to you. I know it's late over time there. So Mayank brought out an interesting part about the whole life cycle of a customers. When they start up something small, they go to the cloud. Then after that, they start to go on-prem. I mean, that's how a startup or how a small company evolve through the whole content delivery or the whole data centers life cycle. They go to cloud. So that's why you don't see traditionally when you talk about co-location 10 years ago, we used to sell a lot of single cabinets or even half cabinets. Single cabinets, two cabinets kind of deals. That has actually almost all gone when you look at the global perspective. Most of these customers who used to acquire single cabinets, two cabinets are now going to the cloud first because the cloud gives them the agility, the price give them the price advantage over the traditional 1 to 2 rack colo, right? And when they grow to, when I see them, when they grow to a certain size of cloud, a lot of them will start saying that, oh, it's not as cost efficient, or they do not, they can they can predict the elasticity, the demand. They do not need that much of elasticity anymore. They start to go to on-prem, right? I think that is a very typical scenario that we are seeing globally. There's one thing about unique more about India as compared to the rest of the world. I think if you look at the India market today, it's very much homegrown, very much local enterprises, very much there's a lot of local enterprises as building content, building data centers. Of course, you had the big hyperscales that's coming, right? The people like the AWS, the Microsoft, they're all good doing big in India. That's fairly common. We see that all over the world. I think Jebez will agree with me. I think they are what we call the hyperscales, right? That's taking up 60 to 70% of the whole co-location market, as we were speaking. India is unique from the rest of the other market in the sense that there is a lack of Chinese players in India now, right? I think that people like Alibaba, they used to be rather aggressive in India until the geopolitical situation set in, and now you don't see the Chinese players coming in. I think they are not growing. They are still inside. I think some of them are still inside India, but they are not growing as far as what we see them grow in the rest of the other region, especially in APAC. The rest of the Chinese content providers, hyperscales, they're all growing very aggressively in the rest of APAC. If you look at, I think Jebez has a lot of reports on that, and I think that's very common, but we don't see that happening in India, right? But the good thing about this is that it actually forced the whole India landscape to change, where you have your own local contents that's coming out from India on your own, right? And that's also going to drive demands over the next, the data center demand over the next couple of years. So that is the one unique part. Other than that, I agree with everybody. What you are seeing, the data privacy law, everybody. I mean, it's not just India. Almost every country that we are seeing, they are trying to have local data privacy laws within the countries. I think, and that's a natural thing to do. So that's when we see decentralization, right, to all these markets.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Michael. And I think sticking back with you again on the whole topic of decentralization and the uniqueness of India, and you're based in Singapore, and Singapore is sort of that, hub to serve Asia that most people think of before this decentralization trend is starting to take shape. And to some extent, India is a unique market because you have hyperscalers that have these sort of dual cloud on-ramps that both on-ramp to their cloud nodes in Mumbai, but also on-ramping to their cloud nodes in Singapore as well. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the interplay between the Singapore market and India and how that's changing or evolving over time?
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows here that Singapore traditionally, I think, is a tier 1 market. It's also a regional hub, right? It's a market that serves as a hub for many Asian countries. I think that's mainly due to our whole location and geographical advantage, and also I think the number of submarine cables that land in the country. I think it's the most dense submarine cables market in the whole of Asia Pac, right? So with that, I think traditionally Singapore has been serving content to all over the rest of the region, including India, right? So some of these, of course, right, it has changed over the years, especially now. I think digitalization, the way that it's moved, like for example, in India has over 1.4 million of active companies, the last I checked, right? And 1.3 billion of people who consume data almost daily, right? With the development of the local market, I think this will definitely there will be a swing in terms of what I call the decentralization of regional hubs to actually what we call local hubs itself, right? So the way I see it, Singapore will still continue to play a role as a regional hub. You can't change things overnight. The cable systems are there, and to replicate the same cable systems coming into the country, it takes many years. That's not going to change overnight. That is going to be there. You will continue to serve as a regional hub, But what I see is that it's going to be more like a hub, and it's going to be regional hub, and also it will be that people, there are a lot of contents that will come to Singapore, set up the regional hub. They will still continue to do that. They will set up their edge nodes within the region to serve the local local contents within the country. And that's what I call, I mean, that's how I see the edge forming up in this region, right? We have key big regional hubs and edge. You see a lot of CDN setting up in all these markets to serve the domestic region. And that's how they typically, content providers try to go into the market. And when they see a market grow, they typically will then grow their own data within the country. And that will just boom. And it's not rocket science to predict that will boom a fair bit in India because of the way your population is and the way you're consuming data, right? Interestingly, I also found a data which is about decades. Decades is about the internet exchange. So decades top in Mumbai actually overtaken the Singapore, the largest internet exchange pop in Singapore, right? So that shows how much data it has grown in India, right? And decades now has one of the world largest internet exchange platform in India as of now, compared to the rest of the world. That speaks for itself how much data has been growing within India.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting data point. Yeah, go ahead, Vipin.
Maybe I could add a couple of points, interesting things that Michael did mention, and talking about the internet utilization increase. Just to give you some numbers, over the last 5 years, the average utilization has increased from 1.5 GB to something like 15 GB. That's like a 50% CAGR for 5 years. Also, it depends on the underlying functionality that one is trying to provide when we talk about decentralization and centralization. Say, for example, if I talk about large setups like YouTubes and Facebooks of the world, I think they would continue to serve India from the core data centers that would be present in locations like Singapore, and to some extent even beyond Singapore, like let's say Taiwan or Hong Kong. But at the other end of the spectrum is, let me call about a government cloud or an enterprise cloud. So I think that balance is something which will happen over a period of time. But when you're talking about the second end of the spectrum, more and more hyperscales do find a lot of value in centralizing in India as well. And an interesting corollary to that, Jabez and Michael, would be that, I've been in this industry for 10 years. Around 10 years back, when we used to speak to the global cloud service providers, most of the decision-making would happen either in Bay Area or Seattle, and we would travel there for contract negotiation. 5 years back, I would travel to Singapore for contract negotiation. And these days, I see a lot of that happening in India. So I think that's also a good measure of the decentralization that's happening.
No, that's a great point, Vipin. And just sticking with you and I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some of the infrastructure challenges that are unique or more pronounced in the India market compared to sort of other global tier 1 markets that you may have experienced, operating in. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what sort of infrastructure challenges are unique to India?
Sure, Jabez. And when I speak of infrastructural challenges, I think I'll stick to those which cannot be solved with capital or something that requires longer time in India. So at the core of hyperscale data centers, you've got a requirement for robust power, and you got a requirement for reliable network. Now, what happens is, till 5 years back, all the data center service providers were building a DC which was 10, 20 megawatts. Now 50 or 100 megawatts has become very common in India. And for the utility to step up to this level, and especially when most of the data centers are still in the urban outlets, it is a difficult challenge because it is a sensitive installation. Adding capacity to the utility substation or connecting the grid from the substation up to the utility is still a challenge that generally takes time. And then, add on some of the local nuances like monsoons, during which it is difficult to get a right-of-way permission, or during which, for right reasons, the utility will not allow you to charge a 100 megawatt transformer and so on. So the end-to-end time that you require to set up a 220 kV substation in India, including all the approvals, on an average can as well go to more than 20 months. So, those are the kind of challenges that you will face in India on power. Second, when you come to something like network, Jabez, you've traveled to Mumbai. So at any given point in time, you would see that there is some other construction going on roads in Mumbai. The number of fiber cuts are generally more frequent, and hence the network planning requires to be more robust. What people like us do, say, for example, our first data center in Mumbai is right next to a 400 kV substation. So that helped us to put an almost private line from the data center to a utility substation that serves part of Mumbai. That easily shaves off a couple of quarters from the overall implementation process. Also on the fiber, you need to plan accordingly. I think getting 4 entry points to a data center or getting 3 diverse routes to the data center is something which has become very common. And I think that problem will be collectively solved, partly by customers, partly by telcos, and partly by service providers like us, where the customers will place the demand. The telcos have started constructing something what they call as data center network, which would run into tens of teras through at least 3 different fiber routes, connecting all the major data centers in the city. For people like us, what is required is when we build our data centers, we make sure that we have an entry point into this data center network. To that extent, the last mile fiber that needs to be created, we participate in that process so that when the customer comes to our doorstep on day one, we establish the connectivity. So I think those are some of the key challenges. And I think the answer would be incomplete without mentioning that, there has been a lot of support system, both from the authorities as well as from the industries and the customers to be able to solve these challenges much faster. Just to give you a quick example on the power front, most of the utilities are happy to work with the industry by taking into account a 5-year projection or a 7-year projection in terms of what is going to be our power uptake, and accordingly also upgrade the infrastructure that is required to transmit and distribute that kind of power. There are also initiatives on policy levels to help people like us generate our own captive power, which is primarily renewable energy, which turns out to be more cost effective as well, while providing you a sustainability certificate too. So those are the kind of initiatives which are coming from within the industry and also from the authorities. But yes, some of these challenges remain unique to India. And I think over a period of time, those will get resolved.
Yeah, no, those are really insightful sort of topics and challenges that you brought up. And Mayank, I wanted to get your opinion because Vipin mentioned connectivity, and connectivity seems to be the fundamental issue with data center growth, whether it be hyperscale or edge. And there's a really interesting question coming from someone from the audience about how edge data center growth is expected to sort of play out in the India market. Do you have some thoughts on how that will pan out? There's hyperscale, there's edge, and people are expecting sort of this massive boom in growth on both segments. But curious if you have an opinion on what that might look like moving forward.
So I think, Jabez, that edge undoubtedly is the future. That being said, I do not see the core dying out. So as use cases and applications sort of drive more and more capacity to being nimble at the edge and sort of doing a lot more heavy lifting at the edge, core is something I think will sort of continue, at least for the foreseeable future. And it is in that context that the challenge of connectivity as well as power become all the more critical. So, the point that Vipin alluded to about operators building data center network, one of our sister companies is doing that in India and as well as in Indonesia. But, as edge proliferates, and it's sort of nobody's fault, it's just that telecom happened before roads did in India. So roads are now trying to catch up. So it's a fact of life all of us have to live with. But these are the challenges which I think also provide a lot of opportunity for some entrepreneurial mindset to solve them. And back to the point about data center only networks, this as a phenomenon did not exist in India. All networks were B2C networks, right? Very inefficient. And with some people now taking up the challenge, it's sort of, you see this moving closer to what perhaps Michael would be seeing in Europe. And the valuation that some of these companies today are commanding are closer to data centers than to a typical fiber company.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe one last question for you, Vipin, before we close out in the interest of time. Want to spend a little bit of time talking about sustainability and how that relates to the India market when you talk about data center development and ongoing sort of operations. What does sustainability translate to in the context of the India market from what you're seeing, Vipin?
Sure, Jabez. It's a long answer, but let me try to give a short capsule. Sustainability, when it comes to sustainability, there has been tremendous intent as well as action across the country, across all the stakeholders. Government, they have set themselves a target of 50% renewable energy by 2030. That accounts for 4 to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030. When it comes to customers, most of our customers are hyperscales or large enterprises. They have their own sustainability goals. In fact, at PDJ ourselves, we have set up a target of 100% green DC by 2030. And we also recognize the importance and responsibility that comes with it and actively working towards it. Talking about some of the other stakeholders, so for example, industry. The industry is trying to make sure that the PUEs have reduced from what it used to be 1.8 to 2, are now coming down to 1.4 to 1.6. There is an equipment level KPI. Even when we do our factory testing for a UPS, we try to see what is the efficiency of the UPS at a 10% loading or a 15% loading. We are conscious about the amount of water that we consume, the amount of green cover that we provide within the data center. Talking about the last stakeholder, which is investor, I think it's a huge opportunity for the investors as well, because currently we have around 150 to 200 gigawatts of capacity as a country, and this is beyond data centers I'm talking about. To reach to 500 gigawatts of capacity, that's upwards of a $200 billion of investment opportunity. So I think all of these things put together, there's an entire ecosystem around sustainability that is developing. A data center is seen to be at forefront of this ecosystem primarily because we are larger users of power. And one of the ways in government is helping, as I mentioned earlier, is creating policies that can easily enable people like us to have captive renewable energy production that is also cost effective, and also we can rely on our own production. So I think all of this put together, I can say it's not just an intent, but it's a very action oriented zone that we see across all the stakeholders.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vipin. And in the interest of time, let's just wrap up this panel. Wanted to thank you, Vipin, Michael, and Mayank for sharing all of your insights on the market. I know we could probably go at least another hour talking about this stuff, but wanted to also be respectful of the other panelists and keynote speakers in the conference today. So I want to hand it back to Litsa. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jabez, for moderating and summing up the conversation so well, and from your time zone as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mr. Mayank, Mr. Michael, Mr. Vipin, thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints and making this a really informative session. So thank you again for that.